And there we go. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truberty, also known in various places as Byron Sidious. Haven't done one of these in a little bit. This is a Storyteller's review, and this is to be a bit more along the lines of going through and reading out specific notes for the work in question. And the work in question today is Peter Straub's Magic Terror, a collection of several of his best and favorite short stories assembled from various places that he submitted to over the course of his years as an author, predominantly in the realm of supernatural suspense and horror. This was one of the many books that I got a couple of years back from a friend of mine at work who had to clear out his home library, and I was the very happy recipient of many of the books that he decided he needed to get rid of. And it is one of the rare instances where you don't get what you pay for. You get something far greater. It didn't cost me a dime. Got this from a friend, free of charge, and more than worth any amount that I would normally slap on your average modern book to be released. The edition that I've got here is in a nice hardcover. If you are of the mentality that you want to keep your favorite titles in good condition, the best option to go for, I would always recommend, is a hardcover or hardback edition. Without getting too much into any of that kind of discussion, because that's something I'd like to talk about separately as its own thing another time. Magic Terror by Peter Straub was released in the year 2000 by Random House, now known as Penguin Random House. And I'm just going to go over the notes that I took for the various stories herein. I did not take notes on the last story in this particular collection, and I'm going to, I'm just going to say, of the 7 tales, it's the only one I didn't read, Mr. Club and Mr. Cuff, because that story is also in another one of his collections that I had recently picked up in electronic format, and it's one of the first couple of entries in that one, so I'll be reading it as part of that collection, which has only got 5 other stories. So I am going to be getting around to it. This is technically not going to be included. The Mr. Club and Mr. Cuff I did not read in this collection because it is going to be in another collection of Peter Straub's that I will be reading in the near future. It's not going to be the next book that I sit down to read for entertainment purposes or analysis, but it will be coming in the next couple of months. But anyhow, back on to it. The first story in the collection is entitled Ash Puddle. And it's a curious kind of first-person tale from the perspective of a self-described obese oddball, a woman who describes herself as an ugly kindergarten teacher. The story uses a kind of fairy tale framework or lens to convey a very Cinderella-esque childhood, with a frosty stepmom stepping in after her own mother died, some rancid stepsisters who are quite nasty and abusive to her. There's a pretty messed up view of artistic perceptions from this narrator character. When I say messed up, I mean she admits to having smeared feces on herself on the front lawn as an adolescent in an act of defiance to embarrass the stepmother and stepsisters. It was weird and gross, but certainly makes for a unique character, particularly given that this was the narrator themselves admitting that she had done this and why she had done it. The story dovetails, after about the halfway mark, into a kind of horrifying implication that Mrs. Ash, our narrator, was a serial child killer who moved from school district to school district across the country, taking out little kids who reminded her of her own childhood tormentors, being, as she remarks them, to be dull, unimaginative, lazy, and rude. A rather bone-chilling implication. Nothing directly confessed to, and in that regard, it's rather cleverly written. Moving on to the second story in the collection, Isn't It Romantic?, which begins itself and squares itself up, establishes through the majority of its narrative to be a strangely engaging third-person perspective spy thriller story about N, a veteran field agent on what he comes to realize is quite possibly his final assignment as someone involved in field espionage and intelligence work. It's a superb portrayal of the quieter sort of fieldcraft story. There's a kind of quiet cynicism throughout the narrative, particularly when N comes to believe that he's going to have to go AWOL and change how he's to complete this assignment if he wants to retire alive. Some of the details of the story were a little bit purple prosy, a little indulgent for my liking. The ending twist, his local flavor hookup, which is kind of common in these sort of spy stories, well, she ended up being a murderous honeypot, which is in itself sort of cliche. It leans a little too much into the stereotype of a man's libido will always be his downfall, which I found a little played out, but it was well executed. There's a really well done alternative world history element that is quietly and subtly layered over the story, which is a more subtle layout than something that might be more ham-fisted, bashing you over the head. It was actually quite appreciable. I've said this before, and I'll say it here, especially regarding Isn't It Romantic from Straub's Magic Terror. While the honeypot cliche is really been done 1,000 times and more in the kind of spy thriller story, I've always defended cliches by saying that when they are done well, they're forgivable. And here, Straub executed that technique or that trope very well. If the storytelling itself, if the linguistics of conversation and dialogue are well put together, if the action and pacing and world building is at least high quality, if not superb or masterful, it is forgivable. And in this case, I found it to be so. The third story in this collection, The Ghost Village, originally published in 1993, has a kind of strange overlap or cross-reference to several other of Straub's works. It is one of the component stories in what is referred to as the Blue Rose series, which is a completed tale that covers a couple of short stories and his novel Coco surrounding the Vietnam conflict. This story had a really intriguing start as we were back to the Vietnam conflict, territory that Straub has touched upon before, as I said, in Coco, which was published previous to this short story. The short story almost serves as a look back and supplemental to that tale. Another interesting note, the village that the story takes place in, this kind of haunted locale, is called Bang To. Now, when I looked this up through Google Translate and through DuckDuckGo translation, the nearest translations amount to big flower or blooming flower, which has its own connotations given the events observed by the principal narrator of the story. The ghosts discussed in this story seem more like vengeful spirits of the sort to me. Hammett is a tragic figure in the end. His own terrible circumstances back home being a disturbingly sharp reflection to the horrors committed in this ghost village of Bong To. Hamlet's a primary character of focus in the story. His son was molested by a trusted church choir leader back home while he's in the field in Vietnam. And he receives a letter from his wife telling him what happened. In the opening page of the story, Hamlet states that he has to get back home so he can kill this man. And he says maybe his wife too, for letting this whole thing happen and not telling him until the pederast was on trial. In the long run, and I'm not spoiling anything here, folks, this book was released in 2000. All right, it's been 26 years. I'm not going to worry over much about spoilers. I still recommend you read it. But it's revealed that when he got home, the moment he heard the guilty verdict handed down at this pederast's trial, he got up, went to the defendant's booth, shot and killed the guy, and then turned to the gallery and killed his wife and his son. And he was gunned down in the courtroom by attendant officers as he was moving to put the barrel to his own head. Just brutal shit. The themes of horror, pain, agony, and haunting tie directly to the novel Coco, which shared many of the characters from this story, including Tina Pumo and Timothy Underhill. Tim Underhill was the probative narrator of this story. It was his unit who Hamnet was a member of. And Underhill is one of the principal characters in the novel Coco. The name Underhill shows up several times throughout a number of Straub's works. I find it curious that there's this name that keeps cropping up. The fourth story in the collection, Bunny is Good Bread, which was first published under the title Fee in 1994 in the Borderlands 4 anthology. The story has a strong opening establishing Fee, short for Fielding, a young 5-year-old boy, and his father, Bob, who takes a phone call from his boss trying to argue against his own firing and termination from a nearby hotel. The mother is hinted at being hospitalized in some way, being very sickly. And Bob comes across in the early pages as being intensely religious. The next note I've got is a positive and a negative. There's a keen double-edged blade in how Fee's mother's sickness is presented in the story. That is rather, to put it bluntly, is ruthlessly appalling. Either the woman is suffering some kind of debilitating crash from a beating at Bob's hands. This is heavily implied. It's never directly stated that Fee's father beat his mother into this semi-comatose state, but it is heavily implied through context in the story. And it would seem that it was in a fit of uber-religious zeal, or something profanely supernatural happened here. Using Fee's youth as a kind of gauzy filter to maintain the mystery, however, and this is where I put the negative in here, felt to me personally somewhat depraved on Straub's part. I didn't care for it. In terms of narrative technique, however, I do applaud his capacity and skill in deploying this narrative tool. The next note in the story that I have here is the Elijah Fund. There's a Deadpool bet in the Ghost Village and in Coco, and it was called the Elijah Fund, based on the name of a commanding officer who the enlisted men were taking bets on how long it would be before he got himself killed. Well, in the story, Bunny is Good Bread, Fee goes to a little movie theater when his father goes to work for the day. And in the movie, the character who's trying to investigate possible embezzlement within a private equity fund company discovers something referred to as the Elijah Fund. This is a pot of where the money was being embezzled to. Throughout the story, my next note, Bob Fee's father is clearly a deeply disturbed man. His ability to flit effortlessly from combative and confrontational with the upstairs neighbors, the Swaneys, to threatening with little Fee, to dancing and whistling before cleaning up his wife, who is in this half-comatose state, again, I suspect from a beating that he delivered. He says at one point, quote, "She made a mistake, and I had to correct her." This is one of the elements that makes me heavily suspect that she's in this state because of Bob's own hand. It's revealed in several spots throughout the story that Fee is revealed to be a budding future serial killer. There's a lot of depraved sexual nastiness and degeneracy and innuendo throughout the story, shades of sadistic sexual violence, much of which was strongly hinted at, some of which was explicit, and none of which was, I personally felt, really contributory to anything good. It was, a lot of it just struck me as over the top and unnecessary, but given the framework of this story and its connection to Coco, and given to the Blue Rose mystery series, as it were, because this story is connected, just like The Ghost Village, to Coco, and to other stories that Straub would go on to write later on. But I'm not going to get too much more into that. The story is effective in that it does what good horror does. It couches in uncomfortable, realistic framing. It unsettles and creeps me out, and that is what good horror is supposed to do. It's supposed to emotionally unsettle you. Now, moving on, we get to the fifth story in this collection, Pork Pie Hat, published first in 1994. There's an outrageously well-defined early sequence about Hat, a blues saxophone player whose performance is magical, transformative, in an awesome and almost magisterial way. The narrator captures this aura poignantly, in terms any lover of music would appreciate. The early narration does a superb job demonstrating the challenges and or deficiencies in being a scholarly or academic partaking of things, the almost compulsory need to find academic interpretations of art, analyses of the performance as opposed to the thing itself, or the artist. Next note I've got is, sadly, this could easily leave the average reader in a bit of a tenuous position. The story's narrator is a university student, an academic, a grad student, yes, but not an entirely effete or annoyingly smug sort of personality. However, it's clear to someone who has dealt with self-important intelligentsia that the narrator might, and very easily might be, en route to becoming exactly that sort of person themselves. It makes for him a nuanced person, which is good, yes, but there's a whipsaw from interested fan to self-important academe, and this is going to likely be alien and disorienting to readers who are either more of the average Joe variety or Professor Muckety-Muck than myself. Turns out, yes, as I had stated, he's a grad student. The story, Pork Pie Hat, is set in the 1990s. Specifically, or rather, roughly 1994, when the story was published. Much of the narrator's outlook seems to be couched in this framework as well. There was, among academia, especially during this time frame, a tendency for students to be sort of the epitome of George Carlin's guilty white liberal sorts, taking a fawning interest in older black culture. This was also, and much more influentially, a period of heightened interest in jazz culture itself in the early 1990s, one that bordered on being ubiquitous. There was tons of cultural fascination and focus at the time on the old jazz and blues era of music and performance. Next note I have here is there's a very self-aware moment as the narrator begins to discuss his interview with Hat. Quote, "If I tried to imitate his grammar, I would sound racist and he would sound stupid." The narrator points out that Hat quit school in the 4th grade, and his language, though precise, was casual, not formalized. Another lovely little plus note. No matter, and this was a line delivered by Hat. It's funny. No matter where you live, there are places you're not supposed to go. And he remarked of one of these places from his own childhood, Backs people, because the taboo neighborhood was referred to as the Backs, in the area that he grew up in, near Hatchville, Mississippi. Quote, "Backs people were so evil, color didn't make no difference to them. Black, white, whatever. They hated everybody anyhow, on principle." I know exactly the kind of place he's talking about. I think we all do. There are places, no matter where you go, especially in America, where there's just neighborhoods that are taboo. They're not the kind of places you're supposed to go hang out if you want to be seen as a respectable person of good repute, or even neutral repute. These are places where no one goes if they've got a good mind or a good head on their shoulders and they're trying to stay out of trouble. The narrative style deployed in Hat's reminiscence is a touch stilted in stretches, but this could very well be down to the narrator of the story admitting that he had changed around much of the diction and word choice during the interview. A nice plus, the shacks that Hat described in the Backs sounded to me initially like they might be tar paper shacks, a common and cheap kind of domestic or domicile common in poverty-struck Americana between the 1920s and 1960s, roughly. And frankly, I guess that correctly because that was confirmed in the next paragraph. On to a strong point, and part of why I almost wanted to separate this story out for its own analysis, but I'm keeping it here wrapped up in the overall of Magic Terror. But this is part of the reason, exemplary of why some short story collections or standalone short stories are worthy of their own standalone analysis and deep dive and discussion. Abby Montgomery and the Ritual. There's a lot to dive into on this crucial and dark sequence in the Backs, a singular moment which serves as a tonal linchpin to the whole of Hat's story. There's an easy opportunity here for the casual or uninitiated reader to be confused or mystified by the scene with this woman lying bloodied on a bed in one of the tar paper shacks in the Backs. Hat tells the narrator that Montgomery looked savaged, dead, given the earlier sighting of a local doctor driving from the taboo little area, looking like he had escaped a horror of some sort himself, and then a second white guy stepping out of the shack itself. One could be forgiven for leaning into Hat's youthful assumptions, biased as they were by race relations in the 1940s and 50s in backwoods Mississippi. This sequence, however, coupled with the woman's later reappearance, apparently now unexpectedly wealthy and pampered, enhance intimations that Mary Randolph had been some sort of witch woman and she was in the shack. Hat earlier claimed that this witch woman had raised Eddie Grimes from the dead after he had been gunned down in front of Hat, that he had seen this zombie ritual raising from the dead. It put me in mind of a lot of folklore about Vodun, hoodoo, and Santeria, of legends of black magic rituals wherein a woman or man could exchange their newborn or unborn child to devils and spirits and demons in exchange for worldly comforts and resources. The atmosphere of Hat's tale certainly lends itself to this conceit. In getting through the third part of the story, Pork Pie Hat, I very nearly breezed right over another expertly crafted sequence, one so subtly constructed that it left me wondering, going back over it, if Straub had intended for readers to almost gloss over it. The comparison between the Hatchville Blade, a local daily paper heavy on gossip, and several unnamed papers out of the much larger and cosmopolitan Biloxi area. Both sets of newspapers covered events surrounding Hat's boyhood Halloween tale, with the Blade being small-town serious and earnest, while being clear in local disfavor toward the backs, without excessive condescension. The Biloxi papers, in contrast, seemed almost giddy to delight in pointing at this backwater and its nearby Sodom and Gomorrah right in their backyard. There's a sense of smug, preening superiority from the more urbane, cosmopolitan papers and peoples of the larger elite city. The narrator even seems to acknowledge and convey this in his own narrative, which makes sense given the time and age, as well as a bit of hinted at disillusionment. The story concludes with a little bit of a knock from me, because there's a heavy-handed supposition that Grant Kilbert, one of Hat's most successful protégés in the musical world, was actually born to the Montgomery woman that night, that Kilbert's claim of black heritage was genuine and a cause of great disgrace to white folk of the area at that time. While certainly this is plausible enough, given relations at the time, it kind of completely robs all of the power and narrative intensity and supernatural elements of the story that came before. Left as an open interpretation with this last couple of pages as heavy implication, this story simply dies on the vine if this is actually the fact of the matter. Hat's own personal testimony of that Halloween night is so rich with ephemeral and otherworldly mystique and wonderment, I can't help but want his version of events to have been what was so. But in a way, it does too. After all, the world of mundane facts ever robs or denies us of the magical and the occult, does it not? Why then would it be surprising that we would almost feel a need to explain away the utterly unreal, much like the character of the narrator did in this story? The last one we're going to cover here is the sixth story, Hunger, an Introduction, published first in 1995. In the introduction, there's a little bit of a stiffness to the preamble, because this first-person ghost story, from a ghost, quickly gets the reader into the tone quite wonderfully. There's a great early line, quote, "Isn't that more or less the menu?" when referring to what happens after we die. Extinction for the materialist and atheist, the moral payback of heaven and hell, or rebirth for reincarnation philosophies. But the line in the actual story is, isn't that more or less the menu? Extinction, moral payback, or rebirth? Brilliantly succinct in its presentation. There's another great and powerful line shortly after that. Quote, most people are about as visible to others as the headlines on a week-old newspaper. The narrator, Frank T. Wardwell, lets us know early on that ghosts are not what we've always thought them to be. The framework timing of the story seems to be set in the 30s, 40s era because he was in 7th grade in 1928, which gives us a kind of a framework for the telling. Another note, while certainly our narrator is very, very well spoken, wonderful vocabulary, he is a little bit of an egomaniacal fop, condescending in the way that engenders very real and much deserved disdain from one's peers. He's so wrapped up in how much smarter and better he is than everyone around him, his own words, that he can't seem to grasp why his fellow smaller children allowed him to be targeted by their collective kind of childhood tyrant, Boy Teutenberg, a childhood bully and tormentor. This is superbly portrayed, and there's a talented display to be sure on Straub's part. Man alive, is this narrator easy to hate. Straub knows how to make an unlikable lead. As our narrator wends the tale of his childhood fall from grace, however, I found myself becoming somewhat suspicious of his degree of honesty and clarity. There were heavy implications threaded through that he may well be an unreliable narrator, which is rather frustrating when one considers the conceit of this tale as a kind of first person setting the record straight regarding ghosts. It muddies the waters, and I'm not sure why he would do that. If this story is supposed to be setting the record straight, perhaps our narrator should not be a liar and thief. But that was shortly confirmed that, yes, he was a thief and a contemptible fellow all around. The turn of events that the story of Frank Wardwell's life took in the back fifth of the story by the narrator himself was shocking but effective, but shouldn't have been too shocking, since they had referred to it themselves in the early going. This is a rather charming and haunting bit of narrative. Love the wordplay there, since he's a ghost. It indicates exactly what it is that ghosts are all about. Hunger. There's a desperate hunger for the small indicators of liveliness in the living. And there's a deep jealousy for the living's ability to experience the world about them. A nigh-on resentment for how baldly and mindlessly we living people take the simplest pleasures of life for granted. The only rough mark here is that this sense of hunger has been remarked upon by some few weavers of paranormal lore and mythology previously, but I'll not fault Straub here for the way he conveyed it, because his examination of the phenomenon was rather masterfully conveyed. All in all, if you are a fan of horror, of the more supernatural sort, of the more pensive and thoughtful sort, I cannot help but recommend highly that you get yourself a copy of Peter Straub's Magic Terror. It's a wonderful story collection, with each entry being its own fine example of great storytelling. That's all for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning. Thank you for listening in. I ask you to take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.